Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Italian Campaign. In This Week in the Italian Campaign, brought to you by the Freedom for Italy Network, Episode 67, Fifth Army Operations in February to March 1945. In February 1945, the Fifth Army launched operations to improve its position ahead of the Allied offensive planned to start in April. The first operation to the west of the front had made little impact. The second, named Operation Encore, aimed at securing the high ground dominating a 10-mile section of Highway 64, which ran northeast to Bologna, the principal target of the planned offensive. The objectives of Operation Encore were peaks and ridges 5 miles west of the road extending from opposite Porretta to south and west of Vergato. It would involve 2 4-corps divisions. The 1st Brazilian Division in the Brazilian Expeditionary Force and the fresh 10th Mountain Division, and it was to be carried out in 2 phases. The first phase called for the capture of Monte Belvedere and its 2 companion peaks, Monte della Torraccia and Monte Castello. The second phase would begin after ground captured in the first was consolidated. It required the capture of ridges northeast of Torraccia and Castello. The operation would push the Fifth Army line up to 7 miles west of Highway 64 and place the ground dominating the highway almost to Vergato in Allied hands. In September 1940, U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall had approved the creation of a mountain fighting unit. A division comprising 3 regiments was constituted in 1943 and designated as the 10th Mountain Division in November 1944 under the command of Brigadier General George Price Hayes. It was intensively trained at high altitude in the winter in the Rocky Mountains. The division concentrated in Naples in January 1945 and was dispatched to the frozen northern Apennines. The most critical feature in Phase 1 was the 3,800-foot Monte Belvedere and the high ground along the 3-mile saddle which connected it with the 3,600-foot Monte della Torraccia. These high points dominated the basin of the Penaro River to the northwest. South of Monte della Torraccia lay Monte Castello, the 3rd critical height in the immediate area. West of Monte Belvedere and extending about 4 miles from northeast to southwest lay the Serchio Capobusco Ridge, which had to be taken before the attack began. It extended from Monte Piage and Monte Mancinello to Pizzo di Campiano. At the center was the 4,526-foot Monte Serchio. The outstanding feature of the ridge was an almost sheer 1,500-foot rock face rising to Pizzo di Campiano. The few roads in the sector were narrow. Supplies would have to be delivered by pack mule, tractor vehicles and jeeps. By careful driving, armored vehicles could be pushed forward in limited numbers. The sector was defended by the German 232 Grenadier Division, thinly spread along an 18-mile front, with the 1045 Grenadier Regiment holding most of the Belvedere to Torraccia Ridge. The 1043 Grenadier Regiment in the Monte Castello area and the 1044 Grenadier Regiment scattered along the Serchio Ridge and the mountains to the southwest. In reserve were the Fusilier Battalion and elements of the 4th Independent Mountain Battalion. The preliminary attack to secure Serchio to Capalbuso Ridge began at 7:30 on the evening of the 18th of February and was assigned to the 1st Battalion of the 86th Mountain Infantry. It involved a frontal assault up the sheer face of the cliff by artificial moonlight created by searchlights. It was so steep in places the troops had to use ropes. Just after midnight on the 19th of February, a company reached the lower slopes of Monte Capalbuso and took the high point. Monte Mancinello was taken by 5 o'clock in the morning. Piaget was captured and Serchio occupied. The trail to the top of Serchio was used for evacuating casualties. A detached platoon reached the summit of Pizzo di Campiano after a 9-hour climb. In the next 36 hours, it repulsed 7 counterattacks. A tramway was built up the cliff to deliver supplies. 7 heavy machine guns and 2 75mm howitzers were placed on the ridge to support the main effort on the west slope of Monte Belvedere. The 1st Battalion was relieved by the 10th Mountain Anti-Tank Battalion and the 10th Mountain Reconnaissance Troop on the 22nd of February. With its left flank protected by the capture of the ridge, the division moved its other units into attack positions for the assault on Belvedere. Artillery, tank destroyers, heavy mortars and tanks were deployed. Air support was to be provided by Rover Joe and 22nd Tactical Air Command. The plan of attack on Monte Belvedere called for 87th Mountain Infantry to move up the western slope of the mountain, while the 85th Mountain Infantry was committed to a frontal attack against Belvedere and Gorgolesco. The 3rd Battalion of 86th Mountain Infantry was to cover the division's right flank by seizing the village of Mazzancana. The capture of Hill 1053 in the saddle halfway between Gorgolesco and Monte della Torraccia was to be the signal for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to attack Monte Castello. 4 Corps artillery supported the attacks. The attack on Belvedere started at 11 o'clock on the night of the 19th of February without artillery preparation for tactical surprise. 87th Mountain Infantry crossed the start line on the road near Querciola. Its 2nd Battalion advanced toward the villages of Pola and Rocca, while the 1st Battalion pressed on towards its summit. There was German resistance in a line of bunkers, machine gun positions, and fortified houses from Belvedere to Rocca Cornetta. Corona was bypassed at about 3 o'clock in the morning. 90 minutes later, the 1st Battalion units reached Belvedere and began clearing a spur to Valpiano. The 2nd Battalion, meanwhile, mopped up around Corona and swung west towards Pola, which was taken at 10:30. The 3rd Battalion moved into the centre of the 87th Mountain Infantry zone north of Corona during the morning. Counterattacks on the 21st of February were beaten off. By darkness, on the 22nd of February, 87th Mountain Infantry had occupied all its objectives. Supporting partisans entered Rocca Cornetta at 9 o'clock that night. By the end of the day, tanks and tank destroyers had reached the ridge northeast of Belvedere. By 6:15 in the morning of the 19th of February, the 3rd Battalion of the 85th Infantry was on the ridge. Around the same time, its 1st Battalion had cleared Monte Gorgolesco and moved towards Monte della Torraccia. The 3rd Battalion of the 86th Mountain Infantry occupied Mazzancana and set up defensive positions on the southeastern slope of the saddle early in the morning of the 20th of February. Counterattacks were repulsed later in the day. At 6 o'clock in the evening, the 2nd Battalion passed through the 1st Battalion to continue the attack. It encountered stubborn resistance as it pushed along the ridge the next day and was hit by a battalion-strength counterattack by the 741 Light Regiment of the 114 Light Division at 7 o'clock in the morning. The 2nd Battalion advanced again in the afternoon and reached points below the summit of Monte della Torraccia by darkness, but the summit was still in German hands by the end of the 22nd of February. It was finally taken by the 3rd Battalion on the morning of the 24th of February. A counterattack the next day was beaten off, ending the battle for the ridge. The 1st Brazilian Division's attack against Monte Castello was led by the 1st Brazilian Infantry at 5:30 in the morning of the 21st of February. The 11th Brazilian Infantry pushed north across the eastern slopes. The main assault on Monte Castello began at noon, with attacks by the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 1st Brazilian Infantry. Leading elements of the 1st Battalion reached the summit in the evening, and resistance on the mountain ended at 9 o'clock. The 11th Brazilian Infantry advanced to capture Abataia. The next day, the 1st Brazilian Infantry advanced north of Monte Castello. By midnight on the 24th of February, La Serra was captured. Resistance in the area finally collapsed around noon on the 25th of February, when several pillboxes were reduced in a bayonet and grenade assault. On the 28th of February, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force took command of the western part of the 10th Mountain Division zone. The 10th Mountain Anti-Tank Battalion and the 10th Mountain Reconnaissance Troop on the Serchio Campiano Ridge came under its control. In the second phase of Four Corps' attack, the 10th Mountain Division had the mission of crossing 6 miles from Monte Torraccia to Monte della, while the Brazilians were given the task of continuing along parallel to Highway 64 with Castelnuovo as their principal objective. Tanks of 751 Tank Battalion and self-propelled 3-inch guns of 701 Tank Destroyer Battalion were to provide armoured support. The 86th Mountain Infantry crossed the start line north of Monte Torraccia at 8 o'clock in the evening of the 3rd of March. Its 1st Battalion advanced across the western slopes of Monte Terminale, and the 2nd Battalion crossed the eastern side of the mountain after a 20-minute artillery preparation. The 2nd Battalion cleared Iola about noon, and the 3rd Battalion passed through to take Campo del Sole, where it dug in for the night. The 87th Mountain Infantry, with only its 3rd Battalion completely committed, cleared Monte Belvedere by noon. Both attacking regiments resumed their advance at 8 o'clock on the 4th of March, following artillery barrages. The 86th Regiment's 1st Battalion took Acidola, cleared Sassomalare, and captured Monte Grande Diano by the afternoon. The 87th Regiment struck east from Pietracolora and captured Monte del Croce soon after 3 o'clock. They were subsequently relieved by the 3rd Battalion of the 6th Brazilian Infantry. The 86th Regiment's 2nd Battalion swung in ahead of the 1st Battalion and occupied Madonna di Brazza by late afternoon. On the 5th of March, Phase 2 operations were completed in the territory between Monte Grande and Highway 64. 86th Mountain Infantry continued to mop up in the northwestern portion of the division zone. 87th Mountain Infantry, supported by tanks, captured Casteldiano. By 7:40 in the evening, the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, which had rushed up from reserve, were encountered for the first time, but could not prevent the capture of the town. The fresh 85th Mountain Infantry's 1st Battalion captured Monte della by evening. The 2nd Battalion took the Monte della Castellana hill mass, including Monte Spiccione hill mass, before darkness. The three-day effort of the 10th Mountain Division resulted in the capture of about 1,200 prisoners and the occupation of more than 35 square miles of territory. The simultaneous Brazilian attack on the right of Four Corps had been coordinated with the advance of the 10th Mountain Division. On the 3rd of March, the 2nd Battalion of the 11th Brazilian Infantry had pushed forward on the right flank of the 87th Mountain Infantry. The same day, the 3rd Battalion of the 6th Brazilian Infantry advanced and mopped up several small hamlets, and on the 4th of March took over all 10th Mountain Division positions east of Pietracolora. In conjunction with the attack of the 85th Mountain Infantry the following day, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 6th Brazilian Infantry outflanked Castelnuovo from the west and entered the village at 7:10. On the right of the 6th Brazilian Infantry and just west of Highway 64, the 11th Brazilian Infantry advanced east of Castelnuovo and pushed forward into positions which overlooked Vergato. In the following days, the 81st Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron moved west of the Reno River to begin the relief of the 11th Brazilian Infantry, and it moved ahead of the 6th Brazilian Infantry to establish a boundary with the 10th Mountain Division. On the 9th of March, the 10th Mountain Anti-Tank Battalion and the 10th Mountain Reconnaissance Troop occupied Monte Belvedere and another Monte Belvedere. The occupation of the mountains completed the establishment of a solid front protecting the left of Highway 64, which was to be the axis of advance for the Fifth Army's big push in April. Operation Encore had been successful but costly. The 10th Mountain Division lost a total of 1,580 casualties, including 338 killed. Brazilian casualties totaled almost 200. Well, that tells you the epic and dramatic story of the battles for the high points, Belvedere, the Riva Ridge on the left, and then finally breaking through all the way to near Vergato. And it's a starry moment for the 10th Mountain Division, and it consolidated its reputation as one of the most effective fighting forces in the American Army in Italy. And of course, for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, it's another important moment in which they again demonstrated their ability to fight against very strong opposition in very demanding conditions. So with that battle, the main operations along the Allied fronts from the right across to the Adriatic, they come to a close. And over the next 2 months, or a bit less than 2 months, preparations have been put in place for the major offensive in April. And I will be dealing with that story in subsequent episodes of This Week in the Italian Campaign. So that's it for today. And so until next time, from everybody here at This Week in the Italian Campaign, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.